So welcome back to the FHIR in 5. We're up to the letter Y, and so I thought we'd cover why FHIR. I know what you're thinking. I'm getting quite creative with my letter usage as we get to the end of the series, but I thought it'd be interesting to uncover why FHIR is so great and why I think it's so great. But also look at it from a comparison of other standards that have come before, which have influenced the way that FHIR has been built and designed. So let's have a look at some of the standards that have come before. The first one that comes to mind for me, at least, is HL7 version 2. It's been around since the late 70s, early 80s, and it had a number of benefits, but also a number of challenges with it. The first one that you'll hear a lot is that if you've seen one HL7 v2 implementation, you've seen one HL7 v2 implementation. Never are there two exactly the same implementations of HL7 v2, which isn't great when you're thinking about having something that's highly interoperable. You want to have something that's consistent and known between two systems at least. It's really positional. So you spent most of your time counting pipes and carrots to work out where you were in the message, which is a fun sport if you want to do that. If you are new to HL7 v2 messaging and you see your message for the very first time, you'll probably freak out and try and figure out what on earth is this thing trying to tell me, what information is this trying to convey, and what's with all those pipes or vertical bars. The other thing you realise about HL7 v2 messaging is that you need to see the spec. So whether it's the generic HL7 international spec, the Australian spec, New Zealand spec, or a vendor's specific implementation of a v2 messaging spec, you need to see the spec to know exactly what's in the message. And the interpretation that you're applying to fields that are within that message can be quite different depending on the implementation itself. So lots of information was conveyed in documents between two vendors trying to understand how to hook systems together, which is not ideal when we're talking about interoperability. We kind of, if you want to think about the sort of plug and play method, you want this thing to just work out of the box, but very rarely did that happen. A great thing about HL7 v2 messaging, it's both a positive and a negative, to be honest, is the extensibility options around a Z segment. So the ability for a message to convey additional information between two parties through the use of a Z segment was a great way for vendors to say, I have this extra information I want to share, and the HL7 message spec doesn't include a spot for it. I'd like to create a Z segment, convey that information, and then this is what you can do with that. Again, that would be defined in the specification. You'd have to share that spec with the other vendor and tell them how to apply the logic to that particular field or fields in the message. I said complex to implement. So even though most implementations of a healthcare system around the globe understand HL7 in one way or form, it is complex to implement. If you've never seen a HL7 message before, it's really daunting to get started. The other great thing about HL7 v2 is it's not trying to be all things to all people. It has about an 80% fit of data that's been conveyed in a message. As I said, the extensibility allows you to add things where it needs to be added, but it didn't have every possible permutation and combination of data that you may or may not need for a particular implementation. So then if we flip that into version 3, so the next version of HL7, it took a very different approach. It modeled a RIM or reference implementation information model, which tried to convey everything about a healthcare context and distill it into one model. And then what would happen is that for particular scenarios, we'd constrain that RIM down to a subset of elements that were important in that context. So as opposed to HL7 v2, which provided extensibility and not trying to be all things to all people, R3 was kind of the inverse to that. So start with everything that could possibly be used in a healthcare context and model that and then constrain it based to what you needed. It was XML based, which made it really verbose, but it made it highly machine interpretable. I guess you could argue that it is human readable in a way, but I get quite scared when I look at a V3, either message or a CDA document, and trying to interpret what on earth it's conveying. I think it's quite complex. And yes, you can use style sheets to make that job easier for you. So now getting to why I think FHIR is so great. The first one really is that low barrier to adoption. The standard and specifications free, which is a big bonus. It means that, you know, no longer is it just the large organizations that are able to buy the specification and start to interpret it in their implementation, but it's also individuals, students, smaller organizations. Everybody can gain access to the specification and get started. It means that we can build highly interoperable solutions and really innovative ones where in the past, you know, smaller organizations may not have access to the specification. So they were really behind the 8 ball from the start. It's really easy to get started and implement. You know, FHIR is all about implementation, making things really easy to implement. So things like examples that you can sink your teeth into, the various libraries that are available online around FHIR to get you started. Another key aspect of FHIR that makes it great, I think, is the fact that it leverages other standards. So things like JSON, XML, RESTful patterns around HTTP verbs, but also in that authorization authentication space where we're using OAuth, OpenID Connect and other standards and specifications to interact with our FHIR implementation. This means that people that understand other industries and other problems and challenges can implement solutions in a healthcare context using the same technologies that they use today for other applications. It also means that mobile app developers can pick up toolkits and standards that they already know and love and implement in the healthcare context really quickly. So again, back to that implementation ease. I think it's really human readable. So if you pick up a FHIR patient resource, especially if you're looking at it in JSON or even XML, it's really easy to read. You can pretty much understand what it's saying without having to read the specification. I think that's pretty magical in the way that works. Certainly far more readable than a HL7v2 message. It also takes the best part, I think, of HL7v2 in that it doesn't try and be all things to all people. It looks at an 80% fit. So if 80% of organizations or implementations require field in a particular resource, then it will be there. Otherwise, it won't. It doesn't mean that those things can't be modeled because the extensibility options available in FHIR are there. It just means that we don't have a lot of bloat in the specification and the standard, and the payloads aren't anywhere near as large as they would be if it catered for all things. Also takes some great pieces out of V3 in my mind around the ability to model documents, the fact that we're sharing resources between implementations allows us to say this is a point in time reflection of some data that's relating to a particular health context. And it could be a document, it could be the fact that we're explaining an encounter or an episode of care in the context of our patient. The fact that our extensions in FHIR allow us to point directly to a specification that explains what this extension is all about allows us to do some pretty magical things. And that's why I think FHIR is such a great standard. The fact that it is fast to implement, it's free to use and free to access the standard. It's all about implementation. So lots of examples and lots of libraries that we can use to get started. So really trying to lower that barrier to adoption. So hopefully you've enjoyed the series so far. We've got one more to go in our series. But if you do want to know more about HL7 FHIR and specifically around the Digital Connect for Health or DC4H platform that Dedalus provides, please contact me at Dedalus or any of the Dedalus team. We're happy to showcase what it can do to solve some of the interoperability challenges that you have.